If you have ever thought about starting your own podcast, you should check out Riverside. Riverside is an online recording studio that lets you record podcasts and video in studio quality from anywhere. And if you click on the affiliated link in the episode description and you buy a subscription, you will also be supporting the podcast. And if you're going to start your own podcast or you just want to continue to listen to great podcasts, you need headphones or speakers. If you click on the Amazon affiliated link, you can get great deals on headphones and speakers. And if you make a purchase, it will also help support the podcast. Both links will be in the episode description if you are interested. I just wanted to give a quick content warning before I start this episode. In this episode, I talk about forms of torture. I will leave timestamps in the episode description for this episode when I start talking about torture and when I stop. So if you need to skip over those parts, you can. But of course, as always, if you need to skip this episode entirely, I completely understand. Alright, now let's get into the episode. Misogyny has been around since forever. And to say that misogyny hasn't played a role in witchcraft accusations throughout history is just untrue. To also say that power hasn't played a role in witchcraft accusations is also untrue. Power doesn't magically appear out of thin air. It has to come from somewhere. Even if you are a royal, your power came from someplace. If you look back on history, especially European history, you will find that many kings and queens have claimed that their power comes from some higher power. But sometimes power comes from not above, but below. Sometimes if you punch down enough, you will have just enough bodies to step on to put you where you want to be. Hi, my name is Courtney Jewell, and you are listening to the 8th episode of the 2nd season of History Shelf, a podcast about history that proves that sometimes fact is even more interesting than fiction. For the 2nd season of History Shelf, I have chosen to title this season Something Wicked This Way Comes. You may know that comes from the William Shakespeare play Macbeth. I am going to be talking each week this season about someone from history that was accused of witchcraft. But as we go along, you will find that the wicked I am referring to were not the ones that were accused of witchcraft, but rather the accusers. You will find that the ones accused were victims of people that were out for revenge and personal gain, and those caught up in the hysteria of it all. And for this week, I am talking about Agnes Sampson. Agnes, aka Wise Wife of Keith, was a Scottish healer and midwife. Agnes lived at Netherkeet in East Lothian, Scotland. Agnes was a well-respected healer in her community. Not much is known about her family, but it is known that she had children and was married, though at the time that she was accused of witchcraft, she was a widow. Agnes was accused of, and even admitted, to being a witch and plotting to kill King James VI. But before we get to that, there are a few things that need to be covered first. Scotland became a Protestant country in 1560. The Church of Scotland was heavily influenced by Reformation leader John Knox. The Church of Scotland had a strict code. They set to stomp out what they believed to be vices. Vices such as dancing, drunkenness, celebrations at weddings, card playing, and luxurious dress. So they must have been hoots at parties. During this time, these Protestants viewed witches as their enemies. King James VI married Princess Anne of Denmark by proxy in August of 1589. After the proxy wedding, Anne tried to make it to Scotland 3 times. Strong winds and a leaky flagship forced Anne to take refuge in Norway. James then sailed to Norway. He also experienced strong winds on his trip, but he did make it to Norway safely, and the couple were married in person. I promise all of this plays an important role in what happened to Agnes. I'm not just giving you a random Scottish history lesson. Where the rumors started, we don't know. They could have started in Denmark, but the rumors that witches caused the winds that kept James and Anne apart did reach James, and he was concerned. He had an interest in learning about the supernatural. He was well educated in the study of demons, called demonology. Now we must turn our attention to a woman named Geillis Duncan. That name may sound familiar if you read and or watched Outlander. She is a herbalist in the series, and in real life she was a healer. The real Geillis worked for a man named David Seaton. David had some suspicions about Geillis. She was a healer, but she hadn't had any schooling, and she would sneak off in the middle of the night sometimes. David believed that the only explanation was that Geillis must have been a witch. I will warn you that the next part of this story contains torture, so if you need to skip over it, do that now. So David, with the help of others, tortured Geillis. They used thumb screws on her fingers to crush them, and they bound a rope around her head and twisted it. All of this torture, which was done illegally by the way, would have caused Geillis excruciating pain. But Geillis did not crack and say that she was a witch. Geillis' tormentors then stripped her naked and shaved all of the hair off of her body, head to toe, and searched for a devil's mark. A devil's mark could have been a mole or a birthmark. After a full body examination, a devil's mark was found on her throat. The torture, humiliation, isolation, and sleep deprivation had finally gotten to Geillis. She admitted to being a witch. She said that she met with other witches and the devil to plot to kill King James VI. She named others as witches, including Agnes Sampson. This was the start of the North Berwick witch trials. Geillis' arrest would be the first of more than 100 arrests. Agnes was questioned and tortured. First, she was shaved from head to toe, just like Geillis. Then they used a witch's bridle on her. A witch's bridle is 4 prongs placed in the mouth, and then attached to a device fastened to the wall. 2 spikes were pressed against Agnes's tongue, and 2 were pressed against her cheeks, making it impossible for Agnes to talk. A rope was also tied around Agnes's neck, and she too was also sleep deprived. After Agnes's torture, Agnes confessed to being a witch. She said that the devil came to her after the death of her husband. She was poor and she had children to take care of, and the devil promised her money and revenge on her enemies. She said that she summoned the devil and it appeared to her as a black dog in her house. Agnes confessed that she caused the storm that led to the drowning of Jane Kennedy. She said that she did this by making a charm by sinking a dead cat that had parts of a dead man attached to it into the sea. Jane was a maid to Mary, Queen of Scots, when Mary was in captivity. Agnes also said that she made a wax figure of another woman's father-in-law because the woman complained about his behavior. Agnes also confessed to trying to make King James VI infertile, and she also confessed to trying to kill King James VI, to James himself. Agnes said that she tried to steal a shirt or other personal linen from James so she could work charms. It is reported that James was skeptical of Agnes's confessions until she told him about a conversation that he had with Princess Anne of Denmark on their wedding night. A pamphlet called News from Scotland reported this story. Some historians are skeptical of this story, while others believe that there's no way that News from Scotland would make up such a tale. And so their only explanation for Agnes knowing the conversation that took place between James and Anne is that Agnes must have known a servant that was in the bedchamber of James and Anne, and that servant relayed a conversation that James and Anne had on their wedding night. Now, questioning suspected witches wouldn't become out of the norm for King James VI, but that was out of the norm for a king to do. Before I go any further, I want to make it clear that I don't believe that Geillis should be blamed for anything that happened to Agnes. Both Agnes and Geillis were both victims of a larger system at play here. James had a concern about witches, but he was also trying to prove himself. James was the son of Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary was Queen Elizabeth I's first cousin once removed. Elizabeth had no children and by this point had not named an heir. If you want to learn more about Queen Elizabeth I, you can check out the episode that I did on her. James wanted to not only be King James VI of Scotland, but he also wanted to be King James I of England, and he would eventually become that. He needed to prove himself as a God-fearing king, a king that was willing to rid the world of witches. So the fact that Agnes was a healer and midwife, and James was determined to prove that he was a capable king that could eliminate evil, were both working against Agnes. And there was something else that was not working in her favor, and that was the fact that she was a woman. Throughout history, more women have been accused of witchcraft than men. During this time, women were seen as the inferior sex. They were believed to be more susceptible to the devil. Plus, you add in the fact that she was well respected in her community, and so some men may have felt threatened by that. All of this adds up to the winds not blowing in Agnes's favor. I am not sure just exactly how many charges Agnes was charged with. I read multiple sources and they all had a different number, but most of them have the number at around 53. A jury of 17 men, many of whom Agnes would have probably known personally, found Agnes guilty. Her punishment was death. Her execution cost £6, 8 shillings, and 10 pence. The treasurer's accounts say that the items used to execute Agnes were purchased on January 16, 1591, while the English ambassador Robert Bowes wrote that the execution happened on January 28, 1591. Whatever the day it was, Agnes was taken to the scaffold on Castle Hill, and there she was strangled while being burned at the stake. Agnes and her story has lived on in a few ways. The first episode of the BBC television series Lucy Worsley Investigates was about Agnes. Agnes is referenced in the 7th episode of American Horror Story Apocalypse. The episode is titled Traitor. She is referenced multiple times in the book Shadow of the Night by Deborah Harkness. Agnes was the inspiration for the short horror story The Last Witch of Berwick House by T.J. Podger. And she is on the Heritage floor in Judy Chicago's installation piece called The Dinner Party. She is the third woman that I have covered on this podcast to be a feature figure on The Dinner Party. If you remember, the other two were Dame Alice Kittler and Agnes Waterhouse. And according to some, the real Agnes is still with us today, at least in a way. It is said that her ghost roams the palace of Holyrood House in Edinburgh, Scotland. That was the place where Agnes was interrogated. It is said that the ghost of Agnes is bald, naked, and battered, reflecting the barbaric torture and humiliation she endured in her final days. And that was the life of Agnes Sampson. Thank you so much for listening to the 8th episode of the 2nd season of History Shelf. There are 15 episodes planned for this season. Next week's episode is going to be about Sidonia von Bork. I hope you come back for that. A few things before I go. If you want to follow this podcast on social media, the Twitter is at HistoryShelfPod. The Instagram is at History_Shelf_pod. The Facebook page is History Shelf Podcast. And the TikTok is History Shelf. If you want to help out this podcast financially, there are a few ways that you can do that. One is you can buy merch from the History Shelf merch store. I will leave a link to the History Shelf merch store in the episode description for this episode. Another way that you can help out is to become a Patreon. This podcast is always going to be free, but there are some perks that come along with becoming a Patreon. The first tier is called History Student, and that is $1 a month. And with that, I will send out a thank you on social media to you. The second tier is called History Fan, and that is $3 a month. And with that, you get the first tier, plus you get to vote in a poll that helps me choose the theme for the next season of this podcast. The third tier is called History Buff, and that is $20 a month. And with that, you get the first 2 tiers, plus you will get a handwritten note of thanks mailed to you from me. And the last tier is called History Lover, and that is $40 a month. And with that, you get the first 3 tiers, plus you get to choose one item from the History Shelf merch store. I will leave a link to the Patreon in the episode description for this episode in case you are interested. If you want to help out this podcast financially, but you don't want any of the merch or any of the perks, I have turned on listener support on Spotify for podcasters. But, as always, the best way that you can support this show is to continue to listen. And there are a few other ways that you can help out this podcast for free. One is if you are listening on a platform that lets you rate this podcast 5 stars and or leave a positive review. If you do that, that would be very helpful. Also, sharing this podcast on social media and telling your friends and family that you found a podcast that you enjoy and that you think that they will enjoy will also be very helpful. Alright, well, until next time, keep learning, keep loving history, and come back for next week's episode. Bye.